Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 7, The Battle of Prophetstown, 7th of November, 1811, United States Indiana-based militia, 910 officers and men, American Indian Coalition, approximately 450 warriors. Prophetstown stands as the historic backdrop for the final grand effort of a fading dream, the last valiant stand where the scattered tribes of the American Indians sought to forge a united front against the unstoppable tide of white expansion, a final rallying cry before the storm of history swept them aside.
The first enduring spark of English ambition to survive on North American soil ignited at Jamestown in 1607, where a precarious settlement clung to life on the rugged shores of what would become Virginia. Earlier endeavors to plant the English flag in the New World had crumbled under the weight of bitter winters and scarce provisions. Their downfall rooted in a fatal lack of foresight by settlers unprepared for the merciless elements. Enticed by the intoxicating legends of Spanish conquistadors pillaging golden riches from the heart of Central America, the English adventurers arrived on North American shores with dreams of their own, gilded fortunes gleaming just beneath the soil. Their eyes, gleaming with visions of quick riches, were blind to the stark realities of survival, as the hunger for gold eclipsed the more pressing need for sustenance that would see them through the harsh seasons ahead. The fragile lifeline of Jamestown's survival was woven not by the settlers' own hands, but by the unexpected mercy of the nearby indigenous tribes, whose pity for these desperate newcomers led them to share the secrets of the land. Yet this kindness, like the fading embers of a fire, was met with cold ingratitude. Barely 15 years after Jamestown's founding, the settlers' uneasy peace with the indigenous people gave way to the roar of musket fire and the clash of steel, a tragic prelude to the endless conflicts that would soon ignite all along the Atlantic seaboard. The English colonists who ventured into the wilds of North America harbored ambitions quite distinct from their Spanish counterparts, who had stormed the lands of Central and South America with conquest and conversion on their minds. To be sure, the promise of wealth beckoned to the English settlers like a siren's call, but for many the New World was less a destination than an escape, a desperate flight from the grinding poverty and bleak prospects that had plagued their lives in England. Unlike the Spanish, who sought to bend the New World to their will through force and faith, the English came in search of new beginnings, driven by the hope of carving out a life free from the economic shackles that bound them in England. In the vast wilderness of North America, where the land stretched endlessly beneath the wide skies, farming was the sole thread from which a settler's livelihood could be spun. But to farm meant to possess land, and the land was not empty. It was the ancient and sacred domain of the indigenous tribes who had hunted, fished, and cultivated these territories long before the first English foot ever touched their shores. Initially, the small numbers of settlers posed little threat, and the indigenous peoples, with cautious generosity, extended their aid. But as the trickle of colonists swelled into a flood, and their hunger for land grew insatiable, the fragile peace began to unravel, setting the stage for inevitable conflict. Reluctant to view the indigenous tribes as souls to be saved, the settlers instead treated them with a cold and calculated disdain, their interactions marked by a callousness that would deepen the divide between the two peoples. The simmering tensions soon boiled over into brutal warfare, which spiraled into the dark depths of genocide. In this savage struggle, mercy was a forgotten concept. Battles concluded with the wholesale slaughter of the vanquished, and prisoners were an extremely rare exception. The gruesome climax of King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, in western Massachusetts epitomized this ferocity. Metacomet, the Wampanoag leader, known to the English king as King Philip, was beheaded. His severed head grimly displayed on a pike at Plymouth for a quarter of a century, 25 years, a macabre warning to any who might dare to resist. The origins of the gruesome practice of scalping remain shrouded in controversy, but what is certain is that it became a brutal currency of war, traded by both sides in the escalating cycle of violence. The deep-seated rivalries among the indigenous tribes often prevented a unified front against the colonists. This disunity, coupled with the settlers' superior organization and relentless expansion, resulted in the systematic killing and displacement of countless native peoples as their ancestral lands were seized and transformed. Such was the grim narrative that unfolded over the first 2 centuries of English colonization. Wave after wave of settlers, their numbers and coordination ever growing, relentlessly pushed the indigenous peoples westward. The settlers' attitudes and actions, driven by a sense of entitlement and superiority, only deepened the chasm between the two populations, ensuring that bitterness and bloodshed would be their lasting legacy. Despite the overwhelming odds, indigenous tribes did not submit without a fight. Their resistance flared in powerful episodes, such as their alliance with French-Canadian settlers during the French and Indian War of 1755 to 1760, and the fierce uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion that followed in its wake. Yet these brave efforts were but brief, defiant flickers against the relentless tide of English expansion, which continued its inexorable march westward. The westward pressure of settlement was temporarily slowed by English governmental decrees in the 1760s and 1770s, and further by the tumult of the American Revolution. But when the smoke of battle cleared and independence was secured in 1783, the push into indigenous lands resumed with renewed vigor. It was during this era of unbridled expansion that a formidable figure arose from the heart of the Ohio Valley, Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader whose vision and determination would forge the most serious challenge the white settlers had yet faced in their relentless drive westward. Born in 1768 amidst the lush forests of central Ohio, Tecumseh's life was marked by tragedy from an early age. He was just 7 years old when his father, a Muskogee warrior from Alabama, was slain by white settlers. After his father's death, Tecumseh was taken under the wing of a Shawnee subchief named Blackfish, and in the crucible of this new family, he formed a bond with 2 white captives, Stephen Riddell and Richard Sparks, who became his foster brothers. Tecumseh's natural charisma was further honed under the tutelage of Joseph Brant, a British-educated Mohawk chief. Under Brant's guidance, Tecumseh emerged as one of the most eloquent and powerful orators of his time, his words stirring both fear and admiration across the land. From his sister, Tecumseh, Tecumseh absorbed lessons of compassion and restraint, balancing the fiery spirit of a warrior with the wisdom to temper his actions with mercy. Despite the countless deaths he had witnessed at the hands of white settlers and the blood he had spilled himself in battle, Tecumseh earned a reputation for his humane treatment of captives, a rare quality in a time defined by relentless brutality. Tecumseh's world expanded further when he married a woman of mixed heritage in the 1790s, from whom, along with his foster brothers, he acquired a working knowledge of English, a skill that would serve him well in his dealings with both friend and foe. His heart, however, led him even deeper into the language when he fell in love with a white woman In his quest to understand her world, Tecumseh delved into the works of Shakespeare and the Bible, absorbing their stories and wisdom as he sought to bridge the vast cultural chasm between them. Yet, when she spurned his marriage proposal, demanding that he forsake his Indian heritage, Tecumseh stood resolute, unwilling to betray his people or his identity, even for love. By the dawn of the 19th century, Tecumseh had become a figure of great renown, his wisdom and eloquence commanding respect from both his fellow Indians and the encroaching white settlers. His reputation as a wise and fair mediator grew, and Tecumseh was frequently summoned to arbitrate disputes, his voice carrying the weight of authority in a land fraught with tension and conflict. In 1804, a proud and mysterious transformation overtook Tecumseh's brother, Lalawasika, who, whether in a trance or perhaps a drunken stupor, experienced a vision that would change the course of their lives and the fate of their people. In his vision, Lalawasika glimpsed the fiery depths of hell, a sight so terrifying that it jolted him from his life of alcoholism and propelled him onto a path of spiritual fervor, preaching a return to traditional ways among the tribes of the Northwest Territory. He called for a revival of the old ways, a time before the arrival of the white man, when the tribes lived in harmony with one another and the earth, urging his people to reject the corrosive influence of white goods, particularly the poison of liquor. When Penagashiga, the revered Shawnee prophet, passed away, Lalawasika stepped into the void left by his death, assuming the mantle of spiritual leadership and becoming known far and wide as the Prophet, establishing a spiritual stronghold at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in Indiana. The Prophet founded what would be known as Prophetstown, a sanctuary that drew tribes from hundreds of miles away, all eager to hear his impassioned message. Meanwhile, Tecumseh embarked on a tireless journey across the vast expanse of the American wilderness, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, as he sought to forge a mighty confederation of tribes, united in their resistance against the relentless tide of white expansion. With oratory as his weapon, and an astonishing memory as his shield, Tecumseh passionately recounted the litany of treaties shattered by the whites, using their own words against them in his quest to rally the tribes. From 1802 to 1811, Tecumseh traveled with a formidable entourage of 34 warriors, whose regal demeanor and mastery of ceremonial dances captivated the tribes they visited, leaving a lasting impression wherever they went. United by a common cause and a symbol of defiance, the warriors carried war clubs, painted a vivid red, earning their movement the name of the Red Stick Confederacy, a fearsome emblem of their resolve to stand against the encroaching settlers. Though Tecumseh found his efforts stymied in Tennessee, where economic ties with the settlers had taken root, his fiery rhetoric and unyielding spirit swayed the powerful Creek Confederation of Mississippi and Alabama, drawing them into the fold of his growing resistance. With the voice of a prophet and the fervor of a warrior, Tecumseh exhorted the tribes to ready themselves for the coming storm. He foretold a time when he would stamp his foot and the very earth would tremble, signaling the moment for all to rise up in arms against the white invaders. In his vision, the tremor of his footfall would send shockwaves through the land, uniting the scattered tribes in a single, mighty surge of resistance, a war to reclaim what had been lost. Tecumseh's extensive travels, spanning from the depths of the Mississippi River Valley to the rugged hills of Vermont, cast a long shadow of fear across the white settlements, for they knew his influence was as vast as the lands he had traversed, placing them all within reach of his formidable grasp. His unwavering refusal to bend to the whites by signing treaties, a stance that he wore like armor, only heightened the sense of danger he posed. A leader not just of resistance, but of defiance itself. The combination of Tecumseh's relentless recruiting and his brother's fervent religious revival stirred deep unease among the white settlers on the frontier, as they sensed a great storm gathering on the horizon, threatening to upend their fragile hold on the land. Should these two brothers succeed in uniting the tribes under a common cause, politically, militarily, and socially, the indigenous peoples could, for the first time, muster a force that the whites might struggle to match in both numbers and resolve. The white settlers of the Indiana Territory, increasingly alarmed by the growing power of Prophetstown, turned in desperation to their territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, pleading with him to act before it was too late. Harrison had crossed paths with Tecumseh on 3 occasions, meetings that took place in 1808, 1810, and 1811. Each encounter a tense exchange between two men destined to clash in battle of wills and wits. At each of these meetings, Tecumseh stood firm, demanding that the whites cease their insidious practice of seizing Indian lands through deceitful treaties, his words a stark warning that the days of acquiescence were over. In response to the settlers' mounting pleas, Harrison assembled a militia in late September 1811, seizing the opportunity while Tecumseh was far to the south in Alabama, rallying the tribes to his cause. With the nod from the Secretary of War, William Eustis, but without the knowledge of President James Madison, who was absent from the capital, Harrison was given the green light to strike, setting the stage for a confrontation that would echo across the land. The militia advanced along the winding course of the Wabash River, their progress marked by the construction of Fort Harrison at the site of what is now Terre Haute, a stronghold from which they would launch their decisive blow. On the evening of November 6th, Harrison's militia arrived across from Prophetstown, the gathering darkness mirroring the tension that hung heavy in the air as they prepared for the coming conflict. In Tecumseh's absence, Lalawasika, following his brother's strict command to avoid hostilities, sent emissaries to Harrison under the banner of peace, seeking to negotiate rather than fight. A meeting had been arranged for the dawn, but the prophet, swayed perhaps by a sense of divine urgency or desperation, abandoned diplomacy and ordered a preemptive strike on Harrison's camp at the break of dawn, precisely at 4:15 a.m. Lalawasika, now fully embracing his role as the prophet, assured his warriors that the rituals he had performed would render them invincible to the white man's musket fire. And with this belief burning in their hearts, they charged into battle with fervor. The surprise attack initially threw the militia into disarray, but Harrison, a seasoned commander, swiftly rallied his men, transforming their panic into a disciplined and fierce defense. The rapid and deadly counterattack, coupled with the harsh reality that the prophet's assurances of invulnerability were false, began to erode the resolve of the attacking warriors. As the grim truth of the battle reached the prophet, he desperately urged his warriors to press on, even as fear gripped him himself, leading him to abandon the battlefield, leaving his followers to face the wrath of the militia alone. The prophet's flight, combined with the mounting casualties, shattered the spirit of the Indian warriors, who began to fall back, their retreat signaling the collapse of the attack. As dawn broke over the smoldering battlefield, Harrison unleashed his militia on Prophetstown, They stormed the settlement with brutal efficiency, setting it ablaze, the flames consuming not just the wooden structures, but the hopes of a unified resistance. Harrison, sensing the significance of his triumph, swiftly dispatched reports of a decisive victory to Washington. But despite the success, he chose to withdraw his forces just hours after the battle, leaving behind the charred remnants of Prophetstown. 4 days later, Tecumseh returned to find Prophetstown in ashes. His dreams of a unified Indian nation reduced to smoldering ruins. The once bright flame of hope had been cruelly extinguished, leaving only the acrid smoke of shattered aspirations in its wake. The failure to secure a decisive victory at Prophetstown struck a devastating blow to Tecumseh's aura of invincibility, causing the Red Stick Confederacy, a once promising alliance, to unravel, its strength dissipating like the morning mist. In a last attempt to salvage his cause, Tecumseh reached out to Harrison, seeking a meeting with President Madison himself. However, disagreements over the terms of such a meeting led to its collapse, closing the door on any diplomatic resolution. Disillusioned and disheartened, Tecumseh severed ties with his brother, the Prophet, and with the remnants of his loyal warriors, he crossed into Canada, where a new chapter of his resistance would begin. In Canada, Tecumseh joined forces with the British and Canadian armies, standing shoulder to shoulder with them as they braced against the tide of the American invasion that heralded the War of 1812. Despite early victories that rekindled hope, Tecumseh's journey came to a tragic end at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, where he fell in combat against none other than his old adversary, William Henry Harrison, sealing their fateful rivalry with his death. The alliance with the English proved to be one of the most significant outcomes of this bloody encounter, intertwining the fates of indigenous resistance and British interests against the burgeoning American nation. The government in London, wary of provoking a direct confrontation with the United States, hesitated to openly back the indigenous forces, fearing that such support could ignite a full-blown war with the fledgling American Republic. With the Napoleonic Wars raging across Europe, London had little appetite for embroiling itself in yet another conflict, especially one that could stretch its already strained resources to the breaking point. Yet on the ground, local Englishmen quietly funneled arms to the Red Stick Confederacy. And when Harrison's men uncovered these weapons amidst the ashes of Prophetstown, it added fuel to the already smoldering tensions between England and the United States, pushing the two nations closer to the brink of war. For years, England's restrictions on maritime freedom had stoked the fires of American resentment, each new affront deepening the divide between the former colonies and their old imperial master. The revelation that the English were arming the very tribes that the Americans had battled for generations was seen as a profound insult, striking at the heart of what white Americans believed they had fought for since their first confrontations with indigenous peoples 2 centuries earlier. By June of 1812, the cumulative provocations proved too much to bear, and war was officially declared against England, plunging the two nations into a conflict that would reshape the destiny of the continent. But perhaps most crucial of all was the devastating impact this chain of events had on the indigenous population of North America, whose hopes for unity and resistance were left in tatters. After 2 centuries of relentless defeat and territorial loss, the tribes had finally teetered on the edge of unification, only to see it all unravel in a single disastrous night as the fragile bonds that had been forged were torn asunder. The relentless tide of white settlers, bolstered by their superior numbers and organization, had, over the course of 2 centuries, grown into an unstoppable juggernaut, crushing all in its path. Never again would such a vast alliance of indigenous tribes be forged. The only notable exception came decades later in 1876, when the Sioux and Cheyenne momentarily halted the white advance by defeating George Custer's small force at the Little Bighorn River. But by then, the sands of time had nearly run out, and any hope of a large-scale resistance was already lost. Had Tecumseh succeeded in maintaining the unity of the Red Stick Confederacy, a fierce and widespread conflict would have undoubtedly erupted between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, engulfing the frontier in a war that could have altered the course of history. Perhaps it was already too late, even for a leader as visionary as Tecumseh, or perhaps, had the stars aligned differently, he might have yet succeeded. In mid-December 1811, as if the earth itself sensed the brewing turmoil, a colossal earthquake shook southern Canada around the Great Lakes. Its tremors reached as far as New Madrid, Missouri, where the mighty Mississippi momentarily defied nature and flowed backward, as if time itself were rewinding. The earth rumbled again with ferocity on January 23, 1812, followed by another quake on January 27th, and yet another on February 13th, as if nature conspired to echo Tecumseh's prophetic warnings with each tremor. Given Tecumseh's bold assertion that he would stamp his foot to trigger a great tribal uprising, one cannot help but wonder, perhaps in these seismic events, there was a hint that the power to unite his people and resist the inevitable was indeed within his grasp, if only for a fleeting moment.